So we go now to the work we did. Human axillary secretions influence menstrual cycles. You've heard how human behavior, whether it's women living together, women working together, women having regular exposure to a man, influences their cycles. Well, we found human underarm sweat extracts did it. And what this experiment did, which was these two experiments were published in 1986, we got people who were willing, who were sexually active young adults, who were willing to donate their sweat for this magnificent experiment we were going to do. And what they agreed to do was wear a gauze pad under their arm attached to an undershirt or whatever clothing they were wearing to collect the drippings, and for 6 to 9 hours a day, 3 days a week for a 14-week semester. Again, college students, like most of you, were very involved with all of these research studies. We could never have done any of them without them, and they went on to develop their own careers, so everybody won. But in this study, the extracts were collected, they were brought into the lab 3 times a week, put in a glass jar, labeled, frozen, until we'd freeze them, extract them. Extracting means taking all these sweat extracts, putting them in a long tube, pouring alcohol over it, putting through charcoal, and the liquid that comes out has no odor. It doesn't have any of the stink. And that was the pooled, that we then thawed it, pooled it in batches, froze it again, thawed it, and titrated that stuff into aliquots, little quantities of fluid that smelled like witch hazel. That was what it smelled like. The criteria to be an elite donor, and we wouldn't know that they were elite until all the collections were done, was that they were in a heterosexual relationship, they had agreed in advance they would not wear deodorants for 14 weeks. And I mean, these were noble people making this contribution for 14 weeks. They would not shave their underarms, and they were 27 years old on average, if I remember correctly. They would not wear any perfumes in their underarm. They would wash in the morning and only with ivory soap. And for women, it was even harder to be an elite person. She had to not be using an oral contraceptive, because the contraception is hormones, and hormones alter the cycle. And so we didn't know what that would do to pheromones. They had to have their menses at the full moon, because I presumed intuitively that those will be the most fertile women because of the data that I showed you already. They had to have basal body temperature data that they were collecting at the same time they were collecting the sweat extracts that showed that they had a fertile cycle, because we were only going to use fertile cycles, extracts. And they had to have a cycle length of 29.5 plus or minus 3 days. And when they were all done, we had all the donors, the sweat was collected and frozen, thawed for a year, batched and frozen for the wonderful, lucky recipients. I'm going to tell you about the recipients in a minute. The 4 donor women, their extracts were pooled by the day of their menstrual cycle. There was a day 1 batch, a day 3 batch, a day 5 batch, because we wanted to know, did the women's underarm essence produce synchrony? And you'll see that. The donor men were simpler. All the extracted essences were pooled together. But the women, they were batched from 5 of the 12 cycles that were collected, and they were the ultra elite, who met every criteria at the end when we could see who actually had the records that fit the criteria to be elite. The recipients now, a year later, in the autumn of 1983, came into the lab 3 times a week, and these people were going to keep records every day on a calendar, and I'm going to show you. That's a calendar that looks like this, and this is 1 week, this is another week, and within the week there's Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, the 7 days, and there are about 10 behaviors to check off on each day. Did that happen to them that day? And those things are, did I use aftershave? Did I have petting, affection, and kissing? Did I have sexual intercourse? On and on. All these behaviors, you'll see them listed in a minute. So the recipients were going to be pooled into one of 2 groups. If they had a menstrual cycle that was around 29 days, they were going to get female essence. If they had an aberrantly long or short cycle, they were going to get male essence. So there were 2 experiments that were going to go at the same time, depending on the woman's cycle status at the start. And 19 women were in each of those two groups as recipients. And the results were this. And these results went internationally around the news as front page stories. It was essences, but not placebo, altered the cycle lengths to mimic the previously reported effect of persons on women's cycle. What I've been showing you about interpersonal behavior, this did it without any interpersonal behavior. Male essence 3 times a week was equivalent to intimate exposure 1 time a week. And what I mean by male essence, the person came into the lab and either had, depending on whether they were going to be testing placebo or the putative pheromone, the researcher swabbed this alcohol that smelled like witch hazel above their lip, under their nose 3 times a week, and said, thank you, go home, come on back in 2 days, come on back in 2 days, and keeping that record going, and keep faxing that in. Well, at the end of the study, the male essence to the women with aberrant cycles had caused the cycles to become normalized to the 29-day cycle. Underarm sweat extract can make a woman normal in her cycle, fertile type cycle. It's pretty exciting. Female essence, I wasn't excited about as much because it caused synchrony. I really like the heterosexual dynamic. And those 2 studies were published back to back in 1986.